Sometimes it's hard to face reality. Oh, oh, even though you might get mad at me. Oh, oh, sometimes it's hard to face reality.
What's going on, YouTube? In recent news, everyone's been aware of the story involving the Ray Rice incident. And if you've been keeping up with current news, you'll know that Rice won his appeal with the NFL recently, allowing him to be reinstated into the NFL and allowing him to join or to be signed any team that's willing to pick him up. I think this is one of the most important incidents that's occurred in recent history. Why is this thing so important? Like many people have said in other medias, uh, this shines a huge light on domestic violence in our society. And it also shines a big light on ourselves as well. In this video, I'm going to focus on a couple of things. One, should Ray Rice have been fired? Um, I'm also going to touch on, since he was suspended indefinitely, should he have been reinstated? And what is the social impact of this incident? Now, the disclaimer before I go any further is that I would prefer to kind of give more of a biblical response and biblical suggestions and advice to this particular matter. But the unfortunate truth is that we don't live in a righteous society. We don't live in biblical times where our governments were bound by, bound by God, by religion, and by the word of God. We don't live in that particular society. So I'm going to give you kind of little words based off of kind of what we live, the way that we live in now. So if I say something that, you say to yourself, you know what, a Christian should not be, that's not the mindset that a Christian should have. That's not necessarily the mindset or the way that I would like for things to be. But in the world that we live in, this is probably the better way of thinking than most others. Moving on, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pay homage to the cliche statement. Even though I agree with this statement, I just want to get it out of the way, mainly because it is a given, the statement. So I'll say that, Ray Rice was completely in the wrong for what he did. He was. And, no matter what I say, it will not change my opinion. He should not have done what he did. All right, so now that that's out of the way, I'm not going to bring it up anymore. I'm not going to say it anymore because it's been said, and too many people continue to. It's like people use that statement as a crutch to kind of justify. Anytime they say something that most people don't agree, then they have to retract it by saying, or not retract it, but they got to throw back in. Now I'm not saying that what he did was wrong. And so it kind of doesn't really seem as genuine of a comment. So first thing we're going to look at, should Ray Rice have been fired or should he have been disciplined for what he did by the NFL? Now he was originally given a 2-game suspension after the TMZ video surfaced. And of course he was arrested for that incident, also along with Janae Rice. Now, Rice didn't serve any jail time, and I think he was maybe ordered to. I don't remember what kind of plea he made with on the deal, but he didn't serve any jail time. And I believe that Ray Rice should not have been. If we look at the issue as a whole, I don't believe that Ray Rice should have been disciplined by the NFL at all. I know that's what many people believe, And or I know many people believe that he should have been disciplined, that they should have done something, they should have fired him, or he should have been suspended for more than 2 games. And some of you are probably asking, how could you say that the league shouldn't have punished him for what he did? Now, I do understand that by contract, the NFL does have the right to discipline him. And, it's a situation where, if you want to accept, if you accept the rules, then you got to play by them if you want to stay in the game. But even though you have the right to discipline someone, is, is it the right thing to do? And are you obligated? Is a corporation obligated morally to, or by law, sorry, are they obligated by law to discipline someone for what they do outside of work? Now, what he did, it wasn't, at work. I could understand that if what he did at a league function, or if it was at a meeting, or if he did it during practice, or even on team property. I could understand that because he broke the law at work. And to feel the need to, let's say, fire him definitely, or to suspend him, I completely get it. That makes a lot of sense because what he did at work. But he did this on his own private time. And I'm a big believer of, you know what? I understand that people want to put other people, not themselves, but they want to put other people on this pedestal that they should hold up to a standard that they're not willing to follow. That's how people are. But why should we have that mindset? Is that the right mindset to have? So yeah, if he had done that, then I would be on board. Or I won't say I'd be on board, but I would definitely understand the firing or the indefinite suspension a lot more than I do now. But the issue is that most people believe, or most people act like that a company, that an employer must, that it is their legal binding obligation to step in and discipline one of their employees if they have done something wrong. If I have never seen this statute in any state of any law of any state where a company is required to come in and step in and fire someone because of something that they've done outside of their job. But that's how people act. That the NFL should have done either more, or he should just be fired. Where does it say that? Where is this obligation to do this? It doesn't exist. So when I see people or hear people demanding that he be fired because of it, it boggles my mind. You know what? That's what we have a court system for. It's their responsibility and their judgment or their job to make those particular judgments, not an employer. If this were anyone else, if this were you, if you're one of the people that believes that the NFL should have been fired, or excuse me, the NFL should have fired him because of what he did outside of his job, or if you feel like it was their responsibility to do it, I guarantee you, if you were in the same exact situation, you would not feel the same way. You might say, I should have been fired, but you know what? You're probably a liar. You probably are. You might own up to the fact that, yeah, I did do this. I did make a mistake. So if you fire me, I get it. But you wouldn't want to be fired. You wouldn't feel like you should have been fired. You would only understand that, hey, you know what? In my contract that I signed, I broke this policy, so I should be fired. But why this is a very important issue that has happened in our society is because we are, as a people, we are completely ignoring the real truths when it comes to domestic violence. Now, domestic violence in itself is unacceptable in any circumstance. And we cannot lose sight that domestic violence is not just a female problem. And it's not just a gay male problem. It's not even a male problem. It is a human problem. And we continue to ignore the fact that violence against men perpetrated by women is a huge growing problem in our society and in societies all over the world. And I know a lot of people, they'll throw the stats of, well, it's domestic violence is a problem for men because of the cases where they're in homosexual relationships. No, violence against men perpetrated by women is becoming the fastest or one of the fastest growing problems. And we can't lose sight of that. There are a lot of studies that have shown that domestic violence is just as likely to strike men as they will with women. In fact, the bulk of the evidence indicates that half of all domestic violences that involve kind of an exchange of blows, and the remaining 50% is evenly split between men and women who are brutalized by their partners. So there this belief that men and women, or that men are overwhelmingly just going out and just clubbing their girlfriends and their wives is completely not true. Men and women are equally responsible as perpetrators of domestic violence. And it's too bad to the point that we as a society that we are helping to make this continually a growing problem. And we basically discount the men who are victims. Not only do we do it through through public opinion, our government is just as guilty as not doing anything to step in to help solve the problem. Part of the problem is when domestic violence is perpetrated by a male, it's always looked upon as a crime. The violence, that evil man, and through the eyes of the law, it's criminalized. But when we see cases of women committing domestic violence, we look at it as a mental issue, as a emotional problem that the woman was suffering, and then we start passing out or throwing out passes for women, and they are allowed to get away with it like it's nothing. The one case of Phil Hartman. If any of you guys remember Phil Hartman, he was part of the Saturday Night Live crew, and he was killed by his wife. And they shifted the blame to mental illness, not for the fact that she was abusive to her husband and her family, but no, she was mentally ill. And who can remember the Andrea Yates story where she kills all of her children, drowns them, and she is looked upon as, the only thing that they could really say was that she had an insensitive husband, and that drove her to becoming a murderer. But we can't look at these problems of domestic violence against men because not even our own Department of Justice will even allow for these things to be looked at. Now, for years, the Department of Justice, they basically refused to fund studies to investigate violence or domestic violence against men. And it wasn't until recently that they did start allowing for studies to be done and to fund studies. But the catch was the time had to be equally spent between men and women. The resources had to be equally spent, which I have no problem of continually to fund, the or to provide resources for women who are victims of domestic violence. But what happens to the men who are also victims of domestic violence? Why are men just basically left to just fend for themselves? If we look at just basic stats, one study um, that was done around 32 nations, and it revealed that more than 51% of men and 52% felt that there were times when it was appropriate for a wife to slap her husband. And by comparison, only 26% of men and 21% of women felt that there were times when it was appropriate for a husband to slap his wife. Ultimately, we see that we don't perceive men as being victims, but we do see women as being more vulnerable than men. In the media or in our society for entertainment, we relish in seeing men injured, men being abused, men being hurt. And a lot of times it spills over into reality. If you remember the case of Warren Moon back in 1996, where he tried to restrain his wife after she threw something at him. She threw a candlestick at him, and she threw it at his head, and then she kneed him in the groin. And although charged with spousal abuse, he was only committed. I mean, he was the one that was charged for it, you know, but he was only acquitted of the abuse after she finally admitted to her attacking him and that the wounds that she had were self-inflicted. But you know what? After this this admission of her fault, she did not receive any charges for bringing for there were no charges brought against her, either for her lying or for perpetrating domestic violence against her husband. And even if we look at Warren Moon's situation, because this was more of a high profile case, everyone or many people knew who Warren Moon was. What about the average Joe? And studies have shown that when a man calls the police to report domestic violence, he is 3 times more likely to be arrested than the woman who was abusing him. So even when the man calls the police, when the cops show up, most of the time he's the one that's arrested. And they won't even be, and the men are not being believed. They're not being taken seriously for the crimes that are committed against them. For men committing domestic violence, it's a crime. For women committing domestic violence, it's either a mental issue or it's just swept under the rug. And we as a society, we have to wonder, why is this happening? Why are we allowing for this injustice to take place in a land that's supposed to be a land of law? The resources available for domestic violence are overwhelmingly lopsided towards protecting the woman, the battered woman, than they are to protect the battered man. If we look at the domestic abuse hotline, the domestic abuse helpline for men and women, which is the only national toll-free hotline that specializes in helping male victims of domestic violence. Um, according to their director, um, this coalition will refuse to be able to become a member of the main coalition to end domestic violence in the state of Maine. And this is where the helpline is based. And they were sure that they would be able to receive funding because that's where they are. Now today, this helpline volunteers they field or out of the 550 calls per month that they field that they answer, 80% of those calls are from men or from people who are looking for help on behalf of men. And they're operating on a yearly budget of less than $15,000. And that helps to provide the training for the workers and to help offer victims housing and food and bus tickets and other services. The helplines are problematic because of their lack of access to funding that makes a shelter financially impossible, and that's why they can't operate the way that they want to be able to provide services for male victims as well. So only 10% of funding is ever gone to help fight domestic violence or to help male victims of domestic violence. So we can see that domestic violence against men is getting out of control all over the world. And according to some studies and research that was done in the UK, a columnist, Glenn Pohl, writer for The Guardian, who asked a British actress, Kelly Brook, because she quote unquote had got away with punching two men, complaining that there is little room for the female perpetrator or the male victim in mainstream media. And he went on to say that women are committing violence against men and boys on a daily basis. And international research suggests that as much as half of domestic violence is committed against men. But in the UK, fewer than 7% of convicted perpetrators are female. So what we can learn from Brooks' refusal to take responsibility for her own celebrity violence. She's clearly no ordinary woman, but the gender script she is performing is predictably ordinary. In a 2000 piece from The Guardian, Sophie Goodchild stated that a study showing that women were actually more likely to initiate violence in relationships. And she said that the study was based on an analysis of 34,000 men and women by British academics, and that women have a tendency to lash out more frequently than their husbands or their boyfriends. And Professor John Archer, who analyzed data from 82 U.S. and U.K. studies on relationship violence going back to 1972, he looked at 17 studies based on victim reports from 1,140 men and women, and he stated that female aggression was greater in westernized women because they were economically emancipated and therefore not afraid of ending a relationship. So this is why we see this violence taking place. And but that's only a small part of why women are becoming more violent. We do see that some of these women tend to take advantage of domestic violence laws and procedures, knowing that if a man they assault retaliates, calling the police will basically just results in the guilt being put on them. And women are seeing this, and they know this. And so they have no problem of instigating violence against men, knowing that if the man either has had enough, look, I've had enough, and he either swings back or shoves her down, and one scratch gets put on her, or if he calls the police, it then becomes a he said, she said thing, and the guy is most likely going to be is going to be arrested instead of the woman. The only thing that you can hope for is that the woman would be arrested too. And in some cases that does happen. But that's only when there's damage, visible damage, caused on the woman and the man. But if the guy, if it's the other way around, if there's no visible damage on the man, then most likely the guy's going to jail and the woman gets to continue to do what she does. According to a 2001 edition of the Criminal Justice magazine, it states that girls in the juvenile justice system, who were once called the forgotten few, that concept has gone away quickly. It's faded. And because the increase in the number of girls arrested has dramatically just outshined and outstripped, the number of boys for the past decade. And girls now account for 1 out of 4 arrests. And the stats show in the UK that the greatest increase in arrests are for violent offenses. And this shift, it highlights both the need to better understand the dynamics of females, their delinquency, and the need to fix the criminal justice system's response to these issues. Between 1989 and 1998, arrests for girls for serious violent offenses increased by 64.3%. And arrests for girls of other assaults increased 125.4%. And the research group, the Future of Children, states that between 1985 and 2002, the overall number of delinquency cases for girls increased 92%. And although we see this rise in female violence slowed down a little bit since the early 2000s, the pattern is continuing and reflects across the Western world. For instance, while the number of criminal offenses committed by young men has dropped slightly in the UK, the number of crimes committed by girls has jumped by a quarter of over 3 years in 2008, this was written in 2008. There's also evidence that schoolgirl bullying, which was historically emotional in nature, is now becoming increasingly physical. When you see, these videos on World Star Hip Hop and YouTube, and you see fights and school fights and fights in the neighborhood, an overwhelming percentage of those videos tend to be girls fighting each other. And we see that the girls are starting to become more physically violent in nature. And a lot of experts, they attribute these things for a lot of different reasons, such as, one, the feminazi doctrine, which basically rams masculinity down the throats of women. And what it does is it casts all of these male norms, and some even the vices of males, as the gold standard that women should be embracing in order to get true freedom. And so there we have females that are being encouraged, one, to be lustful in the name of sexual liberation, and they're being fed these girl power messages stressing for them to be more assertive. And then they're exposed to masculinized female characters on TV and the media who model these violent behaviors, such as fighting and cursing and yelling. And usually a lot of those times the violence is against men. The behavior is directed towards men. And so being ladylike today is viewed as being something from a patriarchal society. And this is clearly evident in our culture, where we see this mimicking of what's considered to be traditional behaviors of young men, and we see women engaging in these things, or girls engaging in these things. And by this, we see that girls are buying in to the feminist conception as men behavior as the gold standard. And we see that girls even admit to engaging in violence for the same reason that boys often do, which is usually to impress others. And in girls' case, usually they're trying to impress older boys. But yet we see that men, even though they still, yes, they still predominate when it comes to violent crime statistics. And since men being in greater size and strength, women do constitute the bulk of the serious injuries when it comes to domestic violence. But the finding that women are more likely than men to engage in domestic violence may kind of just seem counterintuitive, but it does make sense.